Good morning to each one of you. It is a blessing to see all of you here. It's nice to see the Nisley family here, a few visitors. Lucas, it's good to have you here this morning. And I was also reminded of a few that aren't able to be here. Miss Mike and Anita this morning, but I hope that they're having an enjoyable day in Nicaragua. I know they have been facing a little bit of the flu too, so we hope that's not going to continue. And also Brother Joe this morning with his headache, as he mentioned. I think we should be praying for him today and ongoing. Sorry that they can't be here as a family. Part of the reason my mind was running that way is because, if you recall, when we went through 1 Corinthians 11 there, where the Apostle Paul is speaking about communion, and he brings out how communion should be drawing us together. I think there should be a family feel on the day of communion. And so I'm very glad that I can participate in this service today with you all. It's exciting. I was reminded of the words of Jesus in Luke 22:15, and he said there to his disciples, he said, "With desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Jesus was looking forward to sharing one more Passover with his disciples. And you know, if I had been in his shoes, I don't know, I probably wouldn't have wanted to eat anything. I would have been feeling pretty terrible. And I think Jesus was already, he knew what he was going to face. And we see that later then in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he prayed to the Father and sweated drops of blood. But he said here, before he got to that point, when he was in that upper room, he said, "With desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you." And my hope is this morning that for each one that is planning to participate today, that you have been looking forward to this communion service. This has been something you've been anticipating. And I really appreciate what's been shared already. I feel like my message is going to be a continuation of kind of what we've been hearing. But I think today's service is a reminder for us. And I think it's important for me, as I meditate on communion, I think it's important for me to remember that not only did Jesus die for the sins of the world, he died for my sins. He died for my sins too. My sins separate me from God, and I am in need of a Savior. And so this morning, I want us to consider what our response should be in light of the sacrifice of Christ. Let's turn for a text to Hebrews chapter 13. There are a few verses here that came to my mind when I was thinking about a message for this morning. I thought, well, I'll read these verses, then I'll go on to something else. It ended up that I kind of just stayed at these verses for quite a while. There's a lot in these verses in Hebrews chapter 13. I do want to read, though, I think it's good for us to read the crucifixion story as well on communion morning, so I want to read some of that. Hebrews chapter 13, verses 10 to 16, though, is where we'll start today. Beginning in verse 10, it says, "We have an altar whereof they have no right to eat, which serve the tabernacle. For the bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned without the camp. Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate. Let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach. For here we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come. By him therefore let us offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually, that is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. But to do good and to communicate, forget not. For with such sacrifices God is well pleased." Now there's a lot that could be said about these verses. I'm not someone that has studied the book of Hebrews a whole lot. I don't claim to be an expert on all the types and shadows of the Old Testament and the New Covenant. And I feel like the Hebrew writer here was writing to Jews who had lived in the Old Covenant. They understood probably a lot of things that I don't fully grasp when I read the Old Testament, because that was they actually lived during the time when Moses' law was in effect. But there are just a few things here that I think are significant. The first one is that God's plan of redemption was in place before the world began. And I love how the Hebrew writer here, he makes a connection between all the sacrifices, and we've heard about that this morning already, the sacrifices in the Old Testament, and how on the Day of Atonement, which I understand was a day where the Jews, they remembered the sins of the past year that they had committed. And they were sorry for those sins. They had a day where they were sorry for those sins. I think it was just one day. I'm not sure. I didn't look into it all that much. And so on top of the sacrifices that they did every day in the tabernacle or in the temple, they also had a special sacrifice on the Day of Atonement for the sins of the people. And that sacrifice was taken out of the camp and burned. You didn't eat anything of that sacrifice. And you know, God's redemption, plan of redemption, didn't just happen when Jesus died on the cross. That plan was in place from the beginning of time. And I got to thinking about, well, when was the first time that God promised the Messiah? When was the very first time in the Bible that God promised to send a Messiah? Would anybody know what that verse is? You can guess what I did because of the age in which we live. I didn't know, so I Googled it. Yes, Genesis 3:15. That verse had kind of come to mind, but I thought, well, is that really a prophecy? And so I started studying into it. Genesis 3:15, God is actually talking to the devil here. He's talking to Satan. And he says this, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. And we've seen that fulfilled, right? Jesus did crush the head of Satan. He crushed the head of the serpent. But Satan also bruised Jesus' heel. Jesus had to endure so much. And more than just the cross. You think about Jesus' whole life here on this earth and all that he endured. And you think about the impact that Satan has had on the seed of the woman. He has bruised Jesus' heel. He has had his impact. But the point I'd like to make here is that sin has always needed a sacrifice. In the Old Testament, it was animal sacrifice. In the New Testament, it was Jesus, the perfect sacrifice. And this is a little bit of a side note, but I think it's worthwhile at times because this story is so familiar. You know, we can read over it, we almost have it memorized. But to think about the symbolism in everything that Jesus did, everything that happened to Jesus on the week leading up to his life and then his crucifixion itself. Nothing happened just by chance. I think God had everything planned out. It all happened exactly like God said it was going to happen. And this symbolism of Jesus being crucified outside the city gates, just as the animal in the Old Testament was taken out of the camp to be burned. I think there's a lot of symbolism there. But I believe the devil has done a very good job, both in our day and age and ever since Jesus died for the sins of the world, he has done a very good job of convincing people that sin really doesn't need to have any consequence. Have you ever been tempted, after you've done something very wrong, just to turn your back on that and think, okay, I just hope that nobody finds out. I hope that nothing happens from this. I hope that this can just kind of be smoothed over. Have you ever been tempted with that thought? I have. I have been tempted with that. Maybe we can just smooth this over. Nothing bad has to happen. There doesn't have to be any consequences for this. And I believe the devil has done very well at convincing people of that. But the Bible clearly says that the wages of sin is death. It always has been death. It always will be death. And I believe the service today should remind us of the cost of sin. That if I go out next week and I do something that is against the will of God, the wages for that is death. It still is, just like it was back then. And that's why Jesus had to die. There's a song I've been listening to recently, an old CD I had for years, and I happened to put it I just have it playing in my truck, and it just kind of plays and plays. I haven't taken it out yet. The song is not a real lighthearted song. It's actually a rather heavy song. The title is Stricken, Smitten, and Afflicted. I don't know how many of you have heard that song before, but it's a song about the crucifixion of Christ. And verse 2 goes like this. It always stands out to me. It says, Ye who think of sin but lightly, nor suppose the evil great, here may know its nature rightly, and its guilt may estimate. Mark the sacrifice appointed. See, he bears the awful load. And who's bearing that awful load? 'Tis the Word, the Lord's anointed, Son of Man and Son of God. And I think as human beings, when we grasp the cost of sin, when we grasp that sin always means death, that is a tremendous blessing actually for us. It may not feel that way at the time, but that is a tremendous blessing to understand that and to recognize that, because it will change the way we live. Second thing I'd like to bring out here is the purpose of Jesus' sacrifice. And it tells us here in Hebrews that Jesus suffered without the gate and shed his blood. Why did he do this? Verse 12 says, to sanctify his people. Have you thought recently about the purpose for which you have been born? How do you feel about how that fulfillment of your purpose is going? You know, sometimes I think about it. I don't think I am facing what I would call a midlife crisis. I'm getting toward the middle of life. And you start to contemplate a little bit more. What have I actually accomplished in life? Life is moving on. I'm getting older. I'm not quite as energetic as I used to be. Am I fulfilling the purpose that God had for me? Because God does have a purpose for each one of us. And that purpose for all of his children is sanctification, I believe. And I would like to just, my mind was going a lot of different places, and we don't have time to go into too great a depth here this morning on all this. The Bible brings out many places that the purpose of Jesus' death was our salvation. Is there a difference between salvation and sanctification? Well, I don't really think that there is, but I think sometimes in my mind, I can start to separate the two maybe just a little bit. Let me explain what I mean. So I had to think of an illustration here. And this is a very simple illustration. But let's just say that we were out here. Maybe you were out looking at this sign that I laid up last week, and thinking about, you know, how nice that's going to look when it's all finished. And all of a sudden, you notice one of the children run out on the road, and you hear a car coming. Now, how many of you here, what would you do if you were in that situation? We all know what we'd do, right? We would make a run for the road. We would run out there and we would grab that child. It wouldn't matter if it was ours or whose it was. We would grab them, and if I was out there, I hope you'd grab me. And we would do something about that. Why would we do that? Well, we would do it because we care about the child. Life is sacred. We don't want to see anybody harmed. And we would bring them back to safety. It might not be that we're, you know, such a wonderful person, but that's just our response. That's how we would respond. I'm sure that's how all of us would respond. In a sense, we saved that child, didn't we? We saved him or her. But I had to think about it. When God saved me, it was a lot more than that. It was a lot more than that. He didn't just reach down and pluck me out of that car's path. See, this could happen in town. I could run out and save the child of a person I don't even know. I could save a child that I've never met before. I could hand them to their parents and I could say, here you go. I'm sure they would be grateful. We might even exchange phone numbers. But more than likely, that child would disappear from my life. I had no purpose in mind other than rescuing the child. And sometimes I'm afraid as human being, for myself, I'm just exposing myself this morning, I can view salvation just a little bit that way. Okay, God saved me. Well, how wonderful, I'm saved. And then I go on about life. But see, when Jesus died on the cross, when God reached down and he saved us, and by the way, he wants to do that for everyone here this morning, whether he's done that yet or not is your choice. That's his desire. He didn't just reach down and save you and hand you to your parent and say, okay, we're all finished. Go on about your life. No, there was a purpose, a plan. There's a reason why he did that. A plan that's been in place from the beginning of the world. It's a lot more than just reaching down and saving someone. And I read something recently, or I heard about something recently, I'm not sure if I read it or not, that stuck out to me, and that is how easy it is to become self-centered. So, there's a sense in which I am the star of, I'm kind of the center of my own universe. Everything I see in life, it's all from my perspective. The needs and desires I have, they're kind of uppermost in my mind, right? That's how we tend to be, and I'm afraid we can view salvation a little bit the same way. God saved me, well, how wonderful, so now I can go on about my life. But what was God's purpose in saving you? God says, look, I saved you from yourself. I didn't just save you so you didn't get hit by the car. I have a plan for you. It's going to last the rest of your life. I want you to become more and more like my son, Jesus Christ. I want you to not just have your own desires, your own whatever you want in life. I don't want that to be center stage anymore. Now, there's a sense in which no matter how sanctified we are, we still have desires. We still have things that we want in life. But I think as we understand the sacrifice that Jesus made for us, as we meditate on that, as we're changed by that, those desires, they take second place. They're still there, but they're no longer front and center. They're no longer what I'm striving for. They're no longer what's driving me. And I think this communion service is a good time to meditate on the purpose of Jesus' sacrifice and to ask yourself the question, am I becoming more and more like him? For which purpose was I born? And here's the exciting thing. The purpose that God has for you will always be far greater than any purpose you could dream up for yourself. That's the amazing thing. Acknowledging Jesus' sacrifice is important. Accepting that his sacrifice was for me is foundational. But this acknowledgement will then bear fruit. It will. Because we come to another point here that I think is also important. And this is something that our Anabaptist forefathers maybe understood a little better than we do. And I think the disciples understood it a little better, experienced it maybe a bit more than we have. The Bible says clearly here in Hebrews that those who follow Jesus, they must follow him out of the gates of Jerusalem to where he was crucified. And they must be willing to bear his reproach. And I had to wonder, I just asked myself this question, I asked you the question this morning, what is the reproach that we must face when we identify with Christ? Do we know what that is? Have we faced that? Now, it's pretty obvious in the story of Jesus' crucifixion what the reproach was for his disciples. If one of your close friends was crucified, that was an awful thing, and you were faced with a stark choice. If I identify with this person, I very well may join him. And I don't think any of us understands just how awful crucifixion is. If we were driving into Taylorsville on Route 64 and we saw someone crucified along the side of the road, it would scar us. I have no idea how I would respond emotionally to that, but I think it would scar me. I don't have a point of reference for that. It seems that we don't live in such a harsh age as they did back then. It was a terrible, terrible thing. And they crucified Jesus right outside the city so that everybody going in and out could see him. It was supposed to be a public display. And so it's pretty obvious why the disciples were frightened and didn't, even though they wanted to identify with him. And I'd like to bring that point out here in Matthew 26, verse 33 to 35. Peter told Jesus, he said, all men may be offended of you, but I will never be offended, he said. He went on to say, even if I will follow even unto death. And he wasn't the only one that said that. We're a little hard on Peter, but in multiple places it says, so said all the disciples. All his disciples said this. But what happened? When it came right down to it, every one of them ran away and denied him. And I think this story brings out just how difficult it can be to identify with Christ. Now, it's maybe easy to understand why they were afraid. Because later, when they did choose to identify with them, how long did they last? The disciples really didn't live very long, most of them, after they identified with Jesus. It was the cause of their death. But it can be a little harder to understand why I, at times, struggle to identify with Christ today. And I have felt it already, just this hesitation to speak a word for Christ, or not shame maybe, but just a timidity about really identifying with Christ. Now, I feel like that's maybe gotten a little better as I've gotten older, but it hasn't totally gone away. There's still a part of me that when I feel called to take a stand, especially when it's kind of contradictory to those around me, and now it's time you're going to choose. Am I going to stand for Christ, or am I just going to go with everyone else? There's something in me that kind of quails a bit. And I've wondered, why is it that I can at times feel hesitant to stand for Christ, and then we look at the world around us and there are people who should be ashamed of what they're doing and they're not ashamed at all. Why is that? Well, I think that's the prince of this world plays a part in that, and I think he would like to convince us that to identify with Christ is not the thing to do. And why would anyone be offended by Jesus anyway? How could anyone be offended by such a wonderful person, the Son of God? And yet I think it's good for us to just acknowledge that if we are serious, if we're going to go all the way with Christ, if we're going to accept the salvation he offers and identify with him, there is a reproach that we will need to bear. And a lot of that may be personal. It may be actually a personal struggle. But is it obvious that I identify with Christ this morning? And if in some way I'm not willing to identify with him, what is holding me back? I think those are questions we should consider. I think it was significant that Jesus was taken out of Jerusalem. He was taken out of Jerusalem. If you wanted to identify with him, you were going to have to leave the city behind and go out to that place of crucifixion. You know, Jerusalem was and still is a very important city to any Jew. It had great religious and political significance. If you lived in Jerusalem, that was a place where, you'd kind of arrived, right? And I think the Jews in Jerusalem felt a little bit superior to everybody else. And so to walk out of Jerusalem and identify with Jesus Christ on the day of his crucifixion, you were turning your back on everything you held dear. That's what you were doing. No more political significance. Very unlikely that you were ever going to be a wealthy person. You were not going to be well regarded in your social circle. You were sacrificing a lot. And I believe that Jerusalem could be viewed as a type of the world today. And if we're going to be serious about following Jesus, we will have to turn our back on the things of this world that contradict the plan God has for our life. Have we acknowledged the impossibility of reconciling the values of this world with Jesus' life and teaching? There are people, even today, that are working pretty hard to convince us that we can reconcile those two, that somehow they're all going to work together. But they never have, and they never will. Can we bear his reproach? And I don't believe that we will ever come to that place where we're able to bear the reproach of Christ until we come to verse 14. And that's why I believe the Hebrew writer reminded his listeners, here we have no continuing city. Will I really be able to sacrifice all for Christ if my focus is here? I don't believe we will. Somehow, through the help of Christ and the help of God, we need to be reminded again and again that our city is elsewhere. Our city is somewhere else. It's not here. And God reminds us again and again of this. The older I get, the more I hear of, so-and-so's passed away. And you think, when is it my turn? When will it be my turn? And regardless of how long we live, our time here is short. And so I believe it's important for us to remember that life on this earth is fleeting. It's not about what happens here. It's about our eternal destiny. And I believe Jesus reminded us of that when he said, I want you to hold this service until I come again. When he comes again, there will be no more need to have a communion service. I don't know that we'll really need to have communion in heaven. I mean, maybe we will, but I would kind of get the sense from the scriptures that the communion service will be finished when we get to heaven. We won't need to be reminded anymore. But until then, I think it is good for us. And I've talked with people of some differing opinions. One brother I talked to a while ago, not from the Anabaptist church, but he said he thinks we should have it every Sunday, like the Catholics do. I said, well, that seems pretty often. To me, I'm not used to that. But I do think that it's good for us to have it, not infrequently. We only do it twice a year. We probably don't overdo it, I don't suppose. Let's turn now to Matthew 27. I'd like to read verses 27 to 54. And I think it's good as we read these verses to remember that this, yes, it was for the sins of the world, but it was for my sin that Jesus did this. We'll start in verse 27, and we'll read to verse 54. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. And they stripped him and put on him a scarlet robe. And when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head, and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they spit upon him and took the reed and smote him on the head. And after that they had mocked him, they took the robe off from him and put his own raiment on him, and led him away to crucify him. And as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. And when they were come unto a place called Golgotha, that is to say, a place of a skull, they gave him vinegar to drink mingled with gall, and when he tasted thereof, he would not drink. And they crucified him and parted his garment, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet. They parted my garments among them, and upon my vesture did they cast lots. And sitting down, they watched him there, and set up over his head his accusation written, This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Then were there two thieves crucified with him, one on the right hand, another on the left. And they that passed by reviled him, wagging their heads, and saying, Thou that destroyest the temple and buildest it in 3 days, save thyself. If thou be the Son of God, come down from the cross. Likewise also the chief priests, mocking him with the scribes and elders, said, He saved others, himself he cannot save. If he be the King of Israel, let him come down from the cross, and we will believe him. He trusted in God, let him deliver him now, if he will have him. For he said, I am the Son of God. The thieves also which were crucified with him cast the same in his teeth. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land unto the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Some of them that stood there, when they heard that, said, This man calleth for Elias. And straightway one of them ran and took a sponge and filled it with vinegar and put it on a reed and gave him to drink. The rest said, Let be, let us see whether Elias will come to save him. Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. And the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared unto many. Now when the centurion and they that were with him, watching Jesus, saw the earthquake and those things that were done, they feared greatly, saying, Truly, this was the Son of God. It's always hard for me to know how much of this story to read, because every bit of it has significance, from the time of the Last Supper all the way through until Jesus' resurrection. But I had to think about the different responses of the people here at the crucifixion. You know, why did they treat Jesus the way they did? They didn't really even know him. What had he done to them? He hadn't done anything to them. But they still take this opportunity to torment him, put a crown of thorns on him, mock him. And then after he was crucified, it says sitting down, they watched him there. And I don't know how hard your heart would have to be to just sit down and watch somebody that's dying on a cross. Because when you die on a cross, you're suffocating. Essentially, you are suffocating. It would be awful. But I think their hearts were hardened. They were probably accustomed to crucifying people. And yet we see toward the end of this account, things had changed. And it says, the centurion and them that were with him feared greatly. They were frightened. But you know what's even more troubling to me? These soldiers weren't Jews. They didn't know anything about the Messiah. They didn't care about the Jews' religion. So they were rather indifferent, at least until all these other things happened. But you also have religious leaders who knew the promise of the Messiah. They knew, they believed in God, and they supposedly loved God. And yet, how they treated Jesus in his dying moments, mocking him and making fun of him and saying, you know, you said you're the Son of God. They must have hated him terribly. And then we have the thieves, you know, these men that knew that they had sinned. Now, the one we know from other accounts, he repented. But we don't read that in this account. But this man who knew that he had done wrong, he deserved what he was getting, and yet he railed on Jesus. He threw this in Jesus' teeth. It would do something for us, and just made fun of him, even in his own dying moments. And then we have the women. I didn't read about that, but in the next verse or two, it talks about the women that ministered to him. And I had to wonder, all those that loved and knew Jesus, what their emotions were as they were at this terrible place. I'm sure that they were probably crushed. They probably thought, this is the end. Everything we'd hoped and dreamed for is finished. And I'm sure they were very frightened as well. But you know, a lot of this happened exactly how God said it would happen. Those soldiers that were just indifferent and doing what they pleased, watching Jesus, they were actually fulfilling prophecy. God had said that Jesus' raiment, that his coat will not be torn, and they did not tear it. They cast lots. And I don't know who got the coat that Jesus wore, but one of those Roman soldiers got Jesus' coat. You know, today, we're not at the cross. We're not actually on site. But through the pages of Scripture, we also get to observe this event. And I had to think about it. Those people who observed, and there may even have been religious leaders that are observing. In fact, we read about them later. They observed, and their hearts were moved, and they repented. But there were those who were there who mocked, and I don't think they ever repented. Where are they today, 2,000 years later? The Bible is clear. I believe it's very clear. Our response to Jesus' suffering and death determines our eternal destiny. And so those people who did not respond correctly, their eternal destiny, if they did not repent of that, was sealed. And it's still true today. It's sobering to think, how would I have responded on that day? We don't know. We weren't there. But we do have a choice today. How will we respond? Will we respond indifferently? Will we maybe even decide that we can't stand Jesus and what he taught? Or maybe we give lip service, yes, Lord, thank you for saving me, but we go on living selfishly. I believe we will be held accountable for how we respond to the sacrifice of Christ. And so today is a good reminder of that. Today I trust that each one of us is sharing in this meal because of our mutual love for Jesus, because of our recognition that we need a Savior. We need the process of sanctification in our lives. All of us want to be more and more like Jesus. You know, as I look out over the congregation this morning, we all dressed up this morning to come. We all are here ready to share in this meal. But I believe every one of us here, we have needs. We have a need of Christ in our heart and life. Every day. We need him in this coming week. We do. And so I hope that we are united this morning in our desire to follow Christ and to become more and more like him. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 11 that this meal should make us, I believe it should strengthen our love for Christ, and it should strengthen our love for each other as we share it together. And I hope it can do that for us today. I had to think of that verse. I think it was maybe even the title for a message that I preached on that passage, where Paul said, rather than just thinking about yourself, he said, carry one for another. And so I hope that can be our experience today, that we're drawn closer together, not just because we're friends, but because we are all serving the same Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So Lord bless you today as you observe this ordinance.